Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Victor from Cyborg for Life, and today we're going to talk about a question that I get asked quite a bit, and that's how does lengthening affect your muscle size after all is said and done? And then we're going to flip the script and answer the question of, do larger muscles in fact make limb lengthening harder than it needs to be? All right, so let's say that you get limb lengthening done on your tibias, and then a year or two later, you realize that your calf muscles are bigger than they were before the surgery, even though you're doing the same type of activity and training that you were previously. What happened? How did your calf muscles get so much larger after the surgery? Well, it's a great question, and in order to answer it, I have to first explain how muscle growth happens. So if you want to skip to the part where I start talking about how limb lengthening affects your muscle size, I'll have a timestamp for that below the video, but I'll do my best to keep it simple and break down all the sciencey stuff. So real quick, there's two ways that a muscle can grow bigger, okay? The first is by a process called hypertrophy, which is an increase in the size of a muscle fiber due to the overload that's placed on it, either through weight and or cellular swelling of fluid or growth factors. And the other way that a muscle grows big is by hyperplasia, which is an increase in the actual number of muscle fibers, okay, which leads to a greater cross-sectional area of that tissue, thus increasing your muscle growth capacity. Now, it's been said that naturally only hypertrophy can happen in the skeletal muscles of adult humans, and that hyperplasia can't, that it's a myth. However, Dr. Jacob Wilson, also known as the Muscle PhD, he wrote an awesome article, which I'm gonna link below the video as well, where he explains how it's really rare, but hyperplasia can in fact occur. Now, he cites some research on how it's been shown in other animals like birds, mice, and even fish that they can undergo hyperplasia given various different conditions. He also refers to one study in particular on humans on the tibialis anterior muscles of adult men. Now, they were exposed, these different muscles, the left and right tibialis anterior muscle, which is the shin bone, the muscle right in front of the shin bone. It was placed under different weight loads. Now, the muscle that was placed under a greater weight load or a stress load resulted in a greater cross-sectional area, meaning it had more muscle fibers, and thus it had undergone hyperplasia. Now, Dr. Wilson touches on different topics that all circle back to the same premise that a given muscle under a large enough stimulus like weight load in a maximally stretched position, hint, hint, can result in hyperplasia. Now, one of these interesting topics that he refers to is known as fiber splitting, which I'll also have an article linked to below. But it's basically when a muscle fiber will actually split apart in order to maintain its function. So what is fiber splitting and how does it happen? Well, it can happen, given three different stimuli. One is, just like Dr. Wilson said, is where a maximum load in a maximally stretched position. The other is known as the oxygen diffusion capacity, meaning that after a muscle fiber grows to a large enough size, it's going to require more oxygen than is readily available, and it's going to need to split off for some breathing room, if you will, okay? And then the third theory is known as the myonuclear domain theory, which basically states that a myonucleus, which is the nucleus of a muscle cell, can only govern a given domain of the muscle fiber. And then outside of that jurisdiction or district, you're gonna need a new muscle fiber and a new myonucleus to rule that area. Now, in simpler terms, this all basically means that if a muscle fiber is overloaded with enough weight and stretch, suffocated due to lack of oxygen, or it's overcrowded, it's gonna need to move to a new town, aka muscle fiber, with a new sheriff, myonucleus, and it's going to need to do so fast before it defects and dies, okay? So now that we understand the context of how muscle growth happens and how fiber splitting occurs, it's time to finally answer the question of how does limb lengthening affect your muscle size after the procedure? So we all know that during limb lengthening of the bones, the muscles and soft tissue comes along for the ride. Well, after a certain amount of length, and this is going to vary from patient to patient, that muscle is going to hit a threshold and run out of reserve slack, okay? Undergoing maximal stretching and extreme eccentric loading, either by your own body weight or if you're doing resistance training with weights, okay, which is going to result in fiber splitting, hyperplasia. All right, now typically to naturally induce hyperplasia, it could take years of doing this stretching and loading. However, limb lengthening is far from typical, okay, and it can expedite the same effect in a matter of months. Another way that limb lengthening can affect your muscle size is by biomechanical leverage differences. So when you lengthen your bones, you're literally changing the anatomical structure of your limbs, and thus the mechanics, okay, are gonna be changed as well. And this could change how the muscles handle load. For example, let's say that after lengthening your femurs, it's possible that the middle portion of your hamstring, the semitendinosus, for example, may take on more of the load that the biceps femoris, which is the lateral portion, typically would, resulting in more mass of the muscle belly. And research research backs this up. In that fiber splitting article, they removed a portion of the gastric soleus of a mouse subject, okay, leaving the much smaller and weaker plantaris muscle behind to bear the brunt of the load. And it actually grew in cross-sectional area, meaning it underwent hyperplasia, okay? And myself, I can actually attest to this of my own limb lengthening case of my lower left leg, okay? Because my gastric and soleus, my gastrocnemius and soleus muscles of my left leg are bigger than on my right. And they actually grew stronger too through my years of training since lengthening, okay? So yeah, after limb lengthening, it's most likely you're gonna grow bigger muscles due to both hypertrophy and possibly even hyperplasia. So now let's flip the script and talk about, do larger muscles make limb lengthening harder than it needs to be? The shorter answer is yes, but the big caveat is if you're not flexible enough, okay? This means that if you have big leg muscles but maximum range of motion flexibility, you could be just as good off as someone who has a quarter of the muscle mass that you do, yet you both experience the same limb lengthening process and achieve similar results, okay? Now, if you're anticipating that you have lengthening coming up in the next 6 months, then you should focus more on stretching and strengthening your muscles without adding a significant amount of muscle mass, okay? But, you know, coming from a professional natural bodybuilder, it is incredibly, now I mean incredibly hard to build anywhere close to enough muscle mass that's gonna negatively impact your lengthening process, assuming that you're flexible enough, okay? Unless you're some genetic freak who can just build muscle by looking at weights. All right, so basically, don't worry about it. Just stretch a lot before surgery and you're gonna be fine, okay? And the good news is that if you're considering cosmetic limb lengthening, you know, to get taller, you shouldn't have to worry too much about how limb lengthening is gonna affect your muscle size because you're gonna be symmetrical in both appearance and strength eventually. However, if you're a discrepancy patient, you should do a lot of unilateral training, meaning one leg at a time to maintain both symmetry and strength, okay? It helps a lot with balance, trust me. All right, guys, so that's all I have for you today. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and hit that like button. Be sure to subscribe, and until next time, this is Victor from Cyborg for Life, signing out. Peace.